Are you ready for the comeback of the year? World War II always generates heated debates around a wide array of topics due to the sheer magnitude of efforts, sacrifices, and countless atrocities committed during the war. Tucker Carlson recently came under fire from Ben Shapiro because of them disagreeing on the morality of using atomic bombs on civilians, with Ben going as far as questioning Tucker's motives behind his statements. This is a very sensitive and complex topic, but Tucker responded on his podcast and completely dismantled Ben's arguments. But before I go into the video, watch the clip.
At one point, I just blurted out for like 15 seconds something I've thought about recently, which is the use of the nuclear bombs, the only time they have been used, in August of 1945 against Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Complex topic. A lot of it's not publicly well known. It killed civilians. It wasn't dropped on a military base. It was killed civilians. And like, I get why people did it, or maybe I don't get it, but I think 80 years later, we can say it's not something to brag about, incinerating civilians. I don't care what the context is. That's evil. That's basically all I said. Holy.
It is important to note that there's significant diversity within the right on this issue, and to get a better understanding of this back and forth between Tucker and Ben, I think it's necessary to examine both men's backgrounds. Tucker self-identifies as a libertarian. This group views war with skepticism and prefers non-interventionist policies that avoid getting the nation into overseas conflicts unless directly attacked. That's why the atomic bombings are portrayed as an extreme use of state power resulting in massive civilian casualties. From this viewpoint, the bombings are seen as a moral failure, arguing that deliberately targeting civilian populations is never justifiable regardless of the strategic objectives. They argue for the importance of adhering to strict ethical standards even in war, suggesting that the end does not justify the means if these means involve direct harm to non-combatants. And people like Ben believe in things like the 10 Commandments, so the 10 Commandments are easy to break when he wants to break them, but not when he decides they should not be broken. By the way, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Now, in contrast, neoconservatives like Ben defending the bombings as a necessary action to end World War II and save lives, both American and Japanese, which would have been lost in cause of the amphibious invasion of Japan. They argue that the bombings, while tragic, were justified within the context of war against Imperial Japan, which had carried out numerous atrocities throughout the Pacific. This group also highlights the role of the bombings in establishing the United States as a dominant post-war global power, which they view as critical in maintaining world order and preventing future conflicts. Just watch this next clip of Ben to see what I'm talking about.
He says things like, how exactly would you justify, why are we talking about how many lives it would save? It's just wrong to drop the bomb. Well, no, actually, if you end up saving more lives than are cost by the dropping of the atomic bomb, then it is morally justified to drop the atomic bomb. And that happens to be the reality of the situation. So yes, it turns out that it was necessary. By the way, if we had not dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the alternative was either an amphibious assault that would have cost probably 1 million American lives, or more likely a giant blockade of the island of Japan, including the mass starvation of the civilian population, which would have resulted in millions of dead Japanese. So why is Tucker just abandoning the moral equation here at all? What is he doing here? That's what's sort of fascinating.
As a self-portrayed fan of history, Ben's ignoring the major fact here, and he's not alone in that, as the majority of Americans are guilty of it too. You see, the prevailing narrative on the end of World War II in the Pacific theater is attributed to the United States' use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, which led to the Japanese surrender. But I'm here to tell you that there was another event that led to the Japanese surrender, which is the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. By the time the US dropped the nukes on Japan, it had already carried out multiple firebombings of major Japanese cities, which led to the mass casualties and destruction even worse than that of the atomic bombs. Although many people on the Japanese Supreme Council were thinking about surrendering, they were avoiding the absolute surrender that the Allies were demanding, thinking that the Soviets would play a facilitating role to reach a conditional surrender that at least protects the emperor and some of the land that Japan had occupied during the war. But when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan just 2 days after the bombings of Hiroshima, and 1 day before Nagasaki was bombed, the Japanese council saw no other option than surrendering, because the alternative would have been fighting two major powers. Additionally, the fear of rapid Soviet advances and the potential for a communist takeover of not only occupied territories but possibly the home islands was a terrifying prospect for Japan's leaders. Records and minutes from meetings of Japan's Supreme War Council indicate the urgency to surrender following the Soviet invasion, fearing the consequences of a potential Soviet occupation. Taking this fact into consideration, one can see that the atomic bombings were unnecessary, and Ben's arguments about a potential land invasion or a total blockade are only a bunch of what-ifs, but Tucker has more to say on this. Watch this next clip to see his response.
And I don't even follow the attacks on me ever, but I kept getting texts from people. Oh, I can't believe you said that, or people are mad at you for saying that. And I thought of all the dumb, cruel, untrue things I have said over 30 years of just talking in public, a lot of which I regret, and I hope I've apologized for every bad thing I've said, but I've said a lot of really things are impossible to defend. That's what they attack me on?
Yeah.
What is that? The principle of using nuclear weapons against a civilian population, you could construct in your mind a scenario where you could justify it, I guess, but it's still sort of, in the cold light of day, hard to defend incinerating civilians. By the way, with incendiary bombs too, or conventional bombs, as in Dresden, or it's just bad. Why would that make people on the right so mad? What is that?
Tucker's correct here. It's funny for me to see how some people on the right are essentially doing mental gymnastics and contradicting themselves defending such events. This adoption of Machiavellian principles leads to ethical relativism, where moral standards shift depending on circumstances and suggests that some actions are permissible or even commendable if they lead to a greater good. This is something the right constantly criticizes the left for because they adopt relativistic approaches when it comes to political and cultural debates. By defending the atomic bombings throughout a relativistic lens, these people contradict their usual advocacy for fixed moral standards, demonstrating a selective application of ethical principles. There's also a view on the right that depicts World War II as some sort of a holy war, and as a clear-cut moral conflict between the forces of good and the forces of evil. This perspective tends to gloss over the ambiguities and contradictions of the Allies' own policies and actions, such as the internment of Japanese Americans in the alliance with the Soviet Union, whose own oppressive regime contradicted the democratic ideals being fought for. By focusing solely on the righteous nature of the war effort, this viewpoint avoids grappling with the morally complex decisions made by the Allies. Additionally, this narrative is often invoked to justify modern military interventions and foreign policy decisions, suggesting a continuity of moral clarity and divine mission in U.S. international conduct. For someone like Tucker Carlson, that moral certitude leads to a kind of moral blindness where it's easy to justify anything that doesn't go for conventional warfare, but also with the advent of nuclear weapons in the last century, it's the moral certitude that justifies the massively skewed civilian to military casualties that are bound to result from an atomic bombing. The moment you find yourself making excuses for it instead of feeling the true weight of what you're talking about, that's when you're going down a similar path to justify the worst moral atrocities that happened in the 20th century. Tucker Carlson spoke about it in the conversation with Joe Rogan, subtly pointing to the neoconservative online media space with people like Ben Shapiro.
Well, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like, it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me. So with that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no? How about like spending all of your effort to prevent this from happening?
That's a world we wish we could go back to, but since the realities of war in this century have changed, so should our moral compass. Denuclearization of the world is practically never going to happen. It's like taking away guns. The criminals will still have them. Because even if one nation possessing those weapons will force rivals to have them as well to ensure a level of mutually ensured destruction. That's the principle that has kept at least some semblance of global peace all throughout the Cold War. What we can do, however, is not to look back and be so cavalier in asserting our moral high ground despite knowing the fact that no such moral certainty on the use of nuclear weapons was claimed even by the people that made that incredibly difficult decision. I think Ben should take over people's perspectives with an open mind and not question their motives. This is the only way for the right to have constructive and calm dialogue without imploding from within before a crucial election season comes our way.